We are at 3 p.m. Eastern, so we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jessica Dean. I am the Director of Marketing with AIM Transportation Solutions. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm going to get started and give you a brief introduction. Today, we have attorney and transportation industry expert Ron Morelock with us. Ron is a partner at the Law Firm of Scopelitis, Garvin, Light, Hanson Feary. This firm offers advice and counsel to more than 5,000 transportation-related clients in the U.S. Ron has been a friend and an advisor to AIM and many of our customers for years. He is the expert when it comes to transportation-related tax and regulatory matters. Ron is going to present to us today on the tax and liability benefits of a simple fleet restructuring. This has been a successful approach for many of AIM's customers. A couple of things I want to note. We are recording this meeting today. Tomorrow morning, or actually even later this afternoon, depending on how quickly the video buffers, I will send out an email with a link to the recording of this session, a PDF of Ron's presentation, my contact information, as well as Ron's contact information. We are going to have an open Q&A at the end of the session, but if you want to reach out to us via email, phone, text, however, after the presentation, you're welcome to as well. You'll have that contact information. I just want to tell you a little bit about this webinar. It's one of a monthly series of webinars that AIM hosts. The subject matter in this series varies, but we consistently aim to provide valuable information to our customers, be it regulatory, driver safety, DOT compliance, or industry-specific topics that are affecting our customers. The list goes on. These webinars are part of AIM's overall consultative approach to both customer service and our overall marketing strategy. So we really aim to not just hand you the keys and say, see if you're next PM. That's not what we're about. It's our goal to be your business's partner in success. As a service provider, we find it's our job to support you in the all-around betterment of your business. If we have the resources to help you in any way, why not share them? That's our philosophy. That's what we do. So we're really not just providing you top-of-the-line vehicles, industry high standards and maintenance, and dependable drivers, although we do provide you with those things as well. So thank you very much for being here. I appreciate your time. I'm going to pass the mic over to Ron. Again, at the end, he'll open up the floor for questions. So you can either at that time unmute yourself or you can ask them in the chat function. Ron, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jess. I appreciate the introduction. Hi, everybody. Ron Morelock from the Scopelitis Law Firm. Just a little bit about us and about me, then I'll jump into the presentation. We're based in Indianapolis, have 10 offices spread throughout the country. Our niche is the transportation industry. We've got approximately 5,000 clients that are for-hire motor carriers, private motor carriers, leasing companies. If it involves fleets, the people, the assets, et cetera, that's what we specialize in. I've been with the firm for 17 years. My practice area is primarily trucking tax related, but also regulatory issues that affect interstate carriers or intrastate carriers, or different types of regulatory matters that affect fleets. So I primarily focus on assets, the trucks, repair parts, etc. So today we're going to talk about private fleet restructuring. And for us, that really means taking a fleet that hauls its own goods and then converting that fleet into a for-hire operation for one of a couple different objectives. Usually it can be for sales tax savings, and I think it's pretty timely right now that a lot of companies are always early in the year looking to reduce expense. I've had a number of calls already this year from different carriers that have been interested in this sort of restructuring in order to save sales tax. It's going to be very specific to the states you have your fleet based in, which I'll talk about here in the presentation. And also there's restructuring for liability protection, and that involves a bit more than a restructuring just for sales tax. And I'm going to focus primarily on leased fleets, although this would also apply to company-owned equipment. I may mention a couple issues related to company-owned, but primarily as I'm giving the presentation, I'm thinking more about lease fleets today and even full-service lease. So with that in mind, I'll move into the the first issue is to really take a look at the fleet and kind of understand where it's currently what type of fleet it currently is comprised of. And what we can find sometimes is we'll have a carrier that is already holds interstate or intrastate motor carrier authority. And that's the piece of paper that you receive from the federal government for interstate permission to operate trucks on a for-hire basis in interstate commerce, which is traditionally across state lines. Or it, again, is a piece of paper from a particular state like Ohio or Illinois or Wisconsin that allows you to operate the truck on a for-hire basis in intrastate commerce. So sometimes even our private carrier fleets already have active authority in the entity that they use, that they have the fleet as well as the shipper. So it's combined into a single entity where they're moving their own product, but they have the authority already in place. In other instances, and I had one of these crop up early this year, somebody talked to the client, and they had set up a separate logistics company, and they'd done it about 7 or 8 years ago, and it had interstate operating authority, but they actually never used it. It was just there. So they kind of had thought about a restructuring, but they never really moved forward. So we had an entity in place to go ahead and use that particular entity. But in some instances, even if you have the interstate authority or intrastate authority, you may be doing enough to get some sales tax savings. And if you are, we would take a look and see, are you claiming exemptions? Are you aware of them? That sort of thing. Do you have appropriate procedures in place? So that's another scenario that you might find yourself in. And the last one here, private motor carrier, is probably the most common. Really, you don't have authority in your current entity. You haven't set up a legal entity. You're a private motor carrier. You've got a fleet. You're moving your own goods. And historically, states that offer for-hire exemptions don't exempt the fleet if you haul your own goods. They really premise those exemptions on, I've got to use my vehicle to haul and be compensated to haul somebody else's product or somebody else's property. If I'm hauling my own, I don't qualify in the for-hire states. But there are a fair number of states where if you have a vehicle that's over 26,000 pounds, for example, in New Jersey, it's exempt, regardless of whether it's private or for-hire. So really, it's going to depend on where the fleet is domiciled or garaged in terms of, do we have opportunities for sales tax savings based on this sort of restructuring? So once we see where the fleet's at, is it private? Is it for hire? Is it interstate, intrastate? All these things kind of factor into a plan to take the fleet on a for hire basis and try to set it up so that you can achieve sales tax savings on your lease fleet, your repair parts, etc. We'll look at the equipment list. We'll look at your locations. We need to know, do you have owned equipment? Do you have leased equipment? If it's a power unit, what type of power unit? Are you using trailers? All these different things in terms of the fleet go into our analysis, because each state's different in terms of how it provides an exemption. Indiana, for example, you could have any type of vehicle and operate for hire more than half the time, and that particular vehicle is exempt. Illinois, on the other hand, says, well, if you've got a motor vehicle, it has to be over 16,000 pounds if you're going to operate it under the rolling stock exemption in Illinois. So really, as we're trying to piecing together the puzzle to see where there's opportunity, there may be instances where the fleet's in a good state, where this type of restructuring provides some value in terms of sales tax savings. Other states may be neutral. So we're going to look at the fleet. I mentioned the gross vehicle weight can come into play in different states as to whether or not there's exemption. I would say you can think in terms of, if you have an interstate fleet with IRP vehicles that have apportion plates, and apportion plates are for those power units that are over 26,000 pounds. They operate in 2 or more states, so they're crossing state lines. There's more sales tax exemptions for those types of vehicles than there are for state base plated vehicles. Those state base plated vehicles are the types that operate on an intrastate basis. So if it's an Indiana carrier, for example, the IRP vehicles going from Indiana to Ohio to Pennsylvania and back, it's over 26,000 pounds. That's an IRP vehicle. If it's just, a vehicle that operates solely from Indianapolis to Fort Wayne and back, it would have an Indiana base plate. If it's over 26,000 pounds, it couldn't operate outside the state of Indiana on that plate. But I just wanted to point that out. Depending on what type of fleet you might have, there's more exemptions available for those heavier vehicles than generally speaking there are for the lighter weight vehicles. We'll look at the headquarters state. Sometimes that can play into where you might be able to title vehicles if they're company owned. We also want to know where the fleet's domiciled. I would say the general rule, if you look at where do states source sales tax on a lease vehicle, it's going to be with an IRP vehicle. There's some of the states will say we're going to source that sales tax to where the vehicle's initially delivered. A lot of states are going to say we're going to source that sales tax if it happens to be garaged in our state. Other states, depending on if it's a non-IRP vehicle, it's almost always the garage state is where you track to the sales tax, and that's where you look to see if there's a potential exemption through operating on a for-hire basis. And then the last point, I sometimes we see carriers that are set up that they've got multiple entities. They've acquired some trucking companies by acquisition, and they may have multiple DOT numbers. This type of restructuring could also help in terms of consolidating the DOT numbers on under a single legal entity, and it removes some administrative burdens of more than one DOT number. So that's another thing that sometimes in these restructurings, it can be beneficial to consolidate DOT numbers. So when you look at the benefits of a private fleet restructuring, I'm going to talk about sales tax mainly, but then also some on liability protection, and you can get both at the same time. So the primary states where we're able to help with sales tax savings are the Midwest states. If you happen to be in some other states that aren't listed, Nebraska is also a good state. Washington's a good state. Wyoming. Rhode Island provides an exemption. Florida sometimes can be a good state. And so there's a few other states that have for-hire, but these are the primary states. And just real quick, Illinois, just so you know, from a power unit side, it has to be over 16,000 pounds, like I mentioned before. Indiana, really any type of vehicle would qualify if you go for-hire. Michigan has to be over 10,000 pounds, probably not a problem. Missouri has they have just a straight out exemption for vehicles that are over 54,000 pounds. Doesn't matter if you're for hire or private, but then they also have a for hire exemption that goes down to about 24,000 pounds on your power units and on trailers that operate to those. So sometimes we find clients that fit into that zone between the 24 and the 54, so it's beneficial for them. Ohio and Pennsylvania work a lot like Indiana in terms of if you go for hire, there's any type of vehicle can qualify. And Wisconsin's a pretty good state, but there's one kind of hindrance, and that is if we set up a separate legal entity, they won't allow the sales tax exemption unless that entity files separately for federal income tax purposes. So in a lot of instances, we'll have an LLC that we set up that's disregarded from the owner. It's convenient for tax purposes. But Wisconsin says you can't really do that and take advantage of their sales tax exemption. So sometimes we've had clients that have there's been enough benefit there that it made sense for them to have that separate filing. There's some additional cost associated with that from the accounting side, but it's a little bit of a limitation for Wisconsin. All these states, or most of the states, that when they, if you were to have a leased unit from AIM, you're going to get charged sales tax, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania on the lease charges. And if you can flip the switch and go for hire, you can immediately cut off sales tax on those lease charges. Illinois is a little bit different from most states when it comes to leased units. Illinois requires the tax paid up front. So if you're going to have new leases coming on board and you position yourself to take advantage of a for-hire exemption, you want to let AIM know, hey, look, we're eligible for the Illinois exemption now, because AIM can claim that through the lessee at the time of titling in Illinois, and thereby you would avoid the sales tax built into your lease costs. Additionally, all these states have for repair and maintenance. So if you got a full service lease and you can flip and go for hire, you can also avoid sales tax charges on your maintenance expense. I'd mentioned you can also have additional liability protection. That would require transfer to driver employment, but that transfer is not required in order to achieve sales tax savings in these favorable states. We can do that through a lease agreement. So your drivers, where they're currently employed, if there's a new legal entity set up to hold the interstate or intrastate authority and operate the vehicles, the drivers can be leased over, so you don't need to have a separate or new employment. It works a lot like, you can think of it kind of like an independent contractor that kind of leases on to a trucking company. In a sense, it's kind of the same concept. There's a lot of driver leasing arrangements in the trucking industry. Now, if you did want to take this and not only achieve sales tax savings in those favorable states, but also enhance insulation of liability, you could decide to transfer driver employment if you set up a new legal entity. I had a client that recently did that. They were interested in Ohio sales tax savings, but for other reasons, they found it beneficial to go ahead and transfer their driver employment to the new trucking entity. So that's something you can do as well. Another benefit I sometimes hear from clients after they do this is they're really able to track their transportation related expenses a lot better, because now they've got a separate legal entity that operates the vehicles, and it helps them internally with the cash flow, tracking their separate business operations, et cetera. So that's one of the benefits we sometimes hear about. And then if you kind of have this come up, and I just recently had this question come up. It's like, is it going to be beneficial for me to do this? I've got 8 trucks, but I happen to have 8 trucks that are in Indiana or Ohio or Pennsylvania, and they're all leased. I would say, that's something you want to take a look at. I have had clients with that small a fleet that have decided to do this, because once you have the structure in place, and particularly if you're leasing, you'll cut off those charges, those sales tax charges going forward indefinitely. And so I always advise that if you kind of are borderline on, well, am I big enough, or does it make sense for me? Let's take a look at your lease costs on a 12-month basis or a 5-year basis, and take the 7% Indiana sales tax and apply that to your lease charges, and that's what you'll save. And I'll talk a little bit about the implementation costs here in a minute, but a lot of those are one time, and really the burdens of adding a new legal entity, and burden is kind of a strong word, but a lot of that's just a kind of a one-time setup, and you're able to go ahead and take advantage of these savings on a go-forward basis. Another question that sometimes comes up from clients is, hey, my trucks are, I send them out and they're going into my customer locations. I really don't want a different name on the side of the trucks, and you don't need to do that. I mean, the restructuring can be really transparent to the customers. It can be transparent to your drivers as well. Through the placarding rules, you can continue to use the same name you've got on the side of the doors right now, even if you set up a separate legal entity to operate the trucks. That's totally within what the FMCSA allows, and so that's not really an issue. You would have to replacard. There is a replacarding requirement, but oftentimes the way we do the restructurings is the DOT number you currently have you'll continue to use that in your new legal entity that's operating the trucks, but it can be placarded in your current name, and then down below that it would say operated by your new entity with the DOT number. So it's pretty transparent, and like I said, the drivers can be leased over, so it's transparent to the drivers as well. So what are the kind of tasks if I'm if this is a good idea for my company, what are the kind of tasks I need to go through? First thing is you'd have a one-time cost if you don't already have an entity out there. Like I mentioned, I had one client that had a logistics company set up. If you don't have that company, you have a one-time cost, which is fairly nominal to set up a new legal entity. It's something our firm could do, or your corporate counsel could do for you as well. There's cost associated with obtaining the interstate authority and intrastate authority in some states that require it. So interstate authority is about $300, and intrastate authority just varies. I mentioned that Ohio has a requirement for intrastate. Illinois and Wisconsin are a few states. Indiana, if you have interstate authority, does not require intrastate authority. So it's kind of on a state by state analysis in terms of whether you need intrastate authority. Oftentimes, if you do need to get intrastate authority and it's not in your domicile state, you may need to get admitted. So that could be an additional cost to get admitted to do business in a state where you operate intrastate with your new legal entity. You will need to, there'll be some accounting procedures that are required. You'd have to maintain separate company books and records for your new trucking entity. I've found that companies that have multiple entities, this isn't really too big a deal for them. If they add a new trucking company, they're familiar with having separate company books and records for their various corporate entities. If you happen to be a kind of a single legal entity, this is a bit, this can be a bit challenging in the beginning, but we can assist or work with your accountants or whether they're internal or external to assist with what you need to do. And once you've got your record set up, then on a go forward basis, there's really it's just getting them set up on a go forward basis. Then you'll have kind of routine monthly process in place. We'd need a new bank account for your trucking entity. It's really important in this scenario where you set up a trucking company to haul for your affiliate, that it's arm's length, that we have charges, that we have agreements in place. It'd be a transportation agreement. Perhaps there's a driver lease agreement. There might be an administrative services agreement. Those sorts of intercompany agreements. There's some charging and invoicing that's required, and more. And that's namely from a, you're getting this good sales tax savings through this structure. In the event you're audited, you want to have your documentation in place, and a lot of this is really from a we don't want it to be so burdensome as you treat it like true third party, but you want to have, it needs to resemble third party. And that's from an audit perspective, in case an auditor were to come in and want to track through your transportation agreements, your invoicing, your charges, etc. That can happen. And it does, I would say it doesn't happen that often. We get calls from clients that are being audited, but if it does happen, you'll want to have your, you want to have all this documentation or all your documentation set up properly. So that's why I mentioned periodic intercompany invoices and payments. We typically do the intercompany charges for a transportation agreement on a cost plus. So try to keep it simple. You take your cost, your lease units, your fuel, if you're paying for the lease drivers, the cost of operating your trucking entity, you'd want to capture that and then have a markup so that you have an arm's length charge. The states really can't regulate for a trucking entity. They can't regulate the pricing. The federal government many years ago, when they deregulated the trucking industry, there's not tariffs anymore, so you can really contract as a trucking company. You have your own ability to contract with your shipper customers, whether it's an affiliate or a third party. You'll need to AIM, if you're leasing your vehicles from AIM, you'll need to let them know you've got a new truck. Of course they know, but you need to let them know you have a new trucking entity and get the documentation in place to take advantage of the sales tax savings. There may be a requirement to file sales tax returns in some states. Indiana happens to be one of those states where if a trucking company is taking advantage of an Indiana sales tax exemption happens to be located here, Indiana requires the company to register for sales and use tax and get a registered retail merchant certificate. And in essence, that process results in having to file an Indiana sales tax return. It's typically once each year, every February. It's an annual filing because you wouldn't have anything that's taxable to report. I mentioned the recollecting the power units. That's an additional expense, but again, it can be transparent to your customers in the way you do that. And then there could be a new payroll if the driver employment is transferred over to your new trucking unit. I also wanted to mention, I don't think I said this, some of our clients, they like to have the option to backhaul. So through this restructuring, in many instances, your sales tax savings can be accomplished just on an affiliated basis. You've got a trucking company, you haul for the affiliate, whether it be the parent company, et cetera. And you meet that definition I mentioned in those favorable states where you're hauling property to somebody else and you get paid for it, and you've got the authority. This also opens the door, and some clients like this if the trucks are available and they can haul for a third party or they can be used. You can use them and also charge and make money off of the trucks through third party hauling. So you'd also be set up through this process in order to do that type of hauling as well. We from a Scopelitis side in this type of restructuring, we do we focus in on the legal and the regulatory work. And then also oftentimes we may work with the client's accountants or the client's in-house tax folks and assist with that process. And that's where I get involved in that sometimes, and sometimes I work with the accountants. But anyway, I'll focus here on just the legal and regulatory things that you would need to, that we would be able to assist with if you decided to do restructuring. The new entity, the admissions, those are required for your new trucking company, the authority filings. We take a look and determine where your trucks are based, what type of operations you have, and determine where you need intrastate authorities. I mentioned the DOT compliance. That can come up to, hey, my drivers, I've got DOT issues with my drivers. If you transfer employment, there's more issues there to address from a DOT side in terms of the driver records. And we got, I don't work a whole lot in that area, but we have others at the firm who are DOT experts. And so if there were a driver employment transfer, we have those folks that can help and make sure that you're in compliance with DOT requirements. Sometimes there's other regulatory permits that you may have in your current entity. I can think like alcohol, if you're transporting alcohol with beverages, that we've assisted through these types of restructures with getting the new permits in place. From an insurance side, that's always a big deal in terms of setting up a new entity for your fleet. And I haven't had a circumstance where a company couldn't add its new trucking entity as an additional named insured on its existing policies. And I haven't had a scenario come up where most of the insurance companies are familiar with multiple entities and fleets and adding additional named insureds to your policy. So that's not been a problem. It's just working with the insurance provider. And also when you get new interstate authority, there's an insurance filing. So your motor carrier has to be under that policy and has to have a certain amount of insurance depending on the type of hauling that you're doing. And the insurance company would make that filing with the FMCSA for interstate authority before that authority can be granted. And then also on your intrastate authorities, there's insurance filing requirements